logistics to get through quickly first before we turn it over to Kelly, who will introduce our speaker. So a lot of you in the class or sitting in this room and perhaps watching on the internet are enrolled in this as a class. I've passed out syllabi. John in the back has some more syllabi if someone needs one. You're either enrolled in the civil engineering version of this class or the U.S. Urban Studies and Planning version of the class. I'm the instructor of record for Urban Studies and Planning. Professor Clifton is the instructor of record for civil engineering. That is important to know when you turn in your final product, usually the journal option that is who you turn it into. Make sure you get that correct. So the requirements for the course are outlined on the syllabus. And the key thing, attendance is a significant portion of your grade. I have a sheet here that this time I'm going to send around. Mark yourself off if you're an enrolled student. If you don't show up on here, it means you registered very recently, so just write your name on the bottom and check yourself off. Try to make sure that this gets all the way around both sides of the room and back to me. In the future, once we start learning your names, I'll just hold this, or Professor Clifton will, and we'll mark you off during the time. Then the next thing are questions. So we have a different speaker each week at the seminar, and Professor Clifton's going to tell you a little bit. We have a theme covering most of the seminars this term. And one of your requirements as an enrolled student is to ask a question of the speaker. Hopefully, on most of the times, we'll have plenty of time at the end for you to verbally ask your question and have the speaker answer it, but sometimes that doesn't always happen. So what we want you to do is write down the question, put your name on it, and then hand it to whoever has that attendance folder. Whichever instructor has that attendance folder, make sure you hand them your question on paper before you leave to make sure that we record it. If you do verbally give your question, hopefully we'll write it down, but it's always good to check to make sure we recorded that before you leave the room. And then the last part of your grade, if you're taking this for a letter grade, you have a couple different options. The one that most students choose to do is the reflective journal, and that is explained on the syllabus, what we mean by reflective journal, but you also have an option to write a paper too. So any quick questions about the syllabus and the course requirements before we launch into today's topic? Okay, excellent. So I'm going to turn it over to Professor Clifton to introduce the theme and today's speaker.
Thank you. Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another term of the Friday seminar. And this year we decided to do something a little different, which is have a thematic seminar, and it's going to be around transportation modeling. And models are used all the time to inform our decisions about long-range transportation plans that help us move goods and people around the region. They're used to help us make decisions about projects like the Columbia River crossing. We're using more and more to evaluate things like how well we're doing in moving towards our greenhouse gas reduction and climate change goals. But one of the things that I realize as I go to a lot of meetings around the state is that these decision makers and the general public often don't understand what these models offer, what they can do, what they can't do, and that's fine because they're very complicated animals or creatures. But we think that as we're basing more and more of our decisions, and we want the public and the decision makers to really understand what information they're getting, that we want to present a layman's view of what these models are. So 8 of the 10 seminars this term are going to be based on these. We're starting today with a talk about what models are, and we're going to progress through what transportation and activity models are, some discussion about integrated modeling, land use modeling, how these models are used in evaluating greenhouse gases, some discussion about freight models, risk and uncertainty, and then at the end of the term we're going to have a debate, if you will, or a call and response between Lynn Peterson, who is the governor's director of transport and sustainability, talking about what she would like models to do, and Keith Lawton, who's a longtime modeler, talking about how models might respond to her vision. So to save some time, I could go on, but I'm going to introduce our speaker. I can't think of a better person to launch off this series. Rick Donnelly has over 25 years experience in modeling. His fingerprints are all over many of the models used in the US and abroad. He has a PhD from the University of Melbourne, and he is the director of the Transport Modeling and Simulation Practice Group at Parsons Brinckerhoff.
I can think of a whole lot of people you'd better hear from, but you're stuck with me. So when I first came to Portland many years ago, I was on an airplane flying here from Denver. And I normally don't talk to people on the airplane because there are some real nutcases on airplanes I found over my career. But this particular person turned out to be really interesting. She's a writer for Sports Illustrated, one of the better friendships I've made riding on an airplane. She gets all kinds of cool tickets to different things. And so as we were sitting there talking on the flight, she says, "So what do you do?" And I says, "Oh, I'm into modeling." And she looks at me and she kind of laughs, says, "Yeah, I'm sure you are. So seriously, what are you into?" And then I realized, oh, okay, so I got to tell her I'm into mathematical modeling, not into the fashion end of it. And that generated a whole slew of questions and everything else about that. And as I've come to learn at every point through my career ever since, that a lot when you talk about modeling, different people have different ideas. So I'm going to give you kind of my idea about what modeling is all about. So I've actually taken kind of 3 lectures today and crammed them down into one. So I had it down to 60 minutes. And then I found out I got 45. So I'm going to talk real fast. You're going to have to listen real fast equally well. But I want to tell you a little bit about models from my perspective as a practitioner. I want to tell you a little bit about how we build these models, because you're going to see over the next couple of weeks some really top-end stuff, really cool models that are just on the bleeding edge of what's going on in the field. And some of them are very complex. And there are some questions you should be asking about, well, how did you build a thing? And moreover, you should know something about, well, how good of a model is it? And I'm going to try to take you through these things today because I don't think you're going to hear this from other people, either because it doesn't occur to them to think about it, or because it's fairly heretical to ask these sort of questions. And so let's go to taking a look at models. Of course, when you talk about models, they're an abstraction of reality. And everyone knows, well, we build these computer models because we want to test policies and we want to look at things and gain understanding about things we can't go out and measure or build in the real world without being really disruptive. But although you're going to see some very different models over the next couple of weeks, they all boil down to this. I mean, a model is a construct of 3 basic things: data about the world, which informs theories, and together with assumptions about the things that you're not able to model, we put all that stuff together and we create some sort of a mathematical or statistical model. Actually, we do the same thing when we build mental models as well, but I'm not going to get into those. And if you build one of these things and do a fairly good job on it, then you can actually test alternative realities, further down the line. And there we have assumptions and data as well. Sometimes it looks like the same data that went into it before. Other times it's about the future condition. But the one thing you need to understand about these models that's very important is that they're all informed by beliefs. Because the model is made by a human. And when you approach these models, you bring with it how you view the world, how you look at data, how you interpret the data that you see. And unless you think that this is a small thing, I would say consider 2 things: climate change and the debate on intelligent design. Both sides of the debate, you've got very smart people. You've got a set of stylized facts. They're looking at the same sort of thing, but from a completely different perspective. They bring different models and different conclusions from ostensibly studying the very same system. And you see the same thing in transport. So a lot of times when you see a model, you're also seeing the reflection of what the person or the team that built it believes. And you need to keep that in mind. There is scientific method in here, but it's a driven scientific method in all fairness. That middle box, when we talk about building models, you need to understand that there is a process. And when you cheat on one process, you get successively worse and worse results when you go down the road. So we start out when we say, I want to do a model design. I want to understand something about what the model is going to be used for. And from that, I can write a specification which describes the algorithms and the math and the data paths through the model. And from that, then you get together with your data, and you might formally estimate a model where you test a number of different functional forms, and you estimate parameters using statistics. Or you might synthesize it if you have no data about it, or you don't understand how the data links together. And once you do that for each aspect of behavior that you're modeling, you put it all together and you calibrate the whole beast, working together as a whole. And then typically there's another thing up here that we call validation. which in layman's terms means you're simply testing the model against data other than the data that it was used to develop. So I might develop a model in 2005 using the best data I have, and in 2010 I might come along, collect some of the same data, and see if it works. And if you get through all of this, and you're still alive and you have hair on your head, then you can actually take this model because it's judged to be good enough to be used in application. So many times you'll hear about these terms, estimation, calibration, and everything else like that. That's how they all cascade together to give you something that we call a model. Now, there are all kinds of ways that you can classify these models. And I've listed everything I could think of in 10 minutes here. And for the story I want to tell you today, I'm going to focus on just one aspect of classifying models, and I'm going to talk about resolution and fidelity of models. And to be clear about what that is, when I talk about fidelity, I talk about the degree of exactness in which I'm representing something. Is it more or less the way the system operates, or is it exactly the way the system operates? Because sometimes, in an approximate way, you can say some very powerful things about a system, how it operates. And then there's resolution. How fine a level of detail am I representing it? Am I at the atomic level? Am I talking about people? Am I talking about households, societies, whatever? That's the level of resolution. So when we first started out with these kind of models, we had what we call sketch planning models, which were very coarse representations of society and infrastructure. The beauty of these models were that they could be spun up really quickly and really fast, and everybody hated them because they were so drastically inaccurate. But they were very low resolution, very low fidelity. And then later on, in the 60s and 70s, that belonged to the era of the aggregate model in transport and land use, where we would take something like Portland and we might splice it into, say, 500 polygons. And we'd count up the number of households in those polygons and the number of people that work there, and we'd come up with some relatively crude mathematical functions that might estimate how many trips would come out of that thing, and that was our model. And as time goes on, we get to the disaggregate models, and that belongs to the late 80s and most of the 90s, where we slice society into successively finer and finer divisions. Instead of just looking at households, we looked at households by income, by number of workers, by number of household members, by number of autos they owned, maybe by area type, maybe other sort of things. Same way with employment. So we were disaggregating society, both in time and space, and we built those models. Now, it occurred to me when I was looking at this a little bit earlier, you may be inclined to think that the size of these circles are the ranges of which fidelity and resolution these things operate in, and that's partially true. But actually, when I built this beast, what I was trying to show you is the number of models in use today. Most models that are used for land use and transport planning are disaggregate. There's still a few aggregate ones left around. There's still a few sketch planning models running around loose in the wild. But most of what we use today are disaggregate models. There's a new breed of models that I won't elaborate on called activity-based models, because someone smarter than me about this is going to talk to you about it. But the essence there is that we're now down to the household level, and we're micro-simulating all the households in Portland. Forget polygons. We're down at individual point locations all over Portland. And moreover, we're trying to get the household interactions between people living in the same house straight, as well as some very sophisticated dynamics. So that's high on the resolution, high on the fidelity end of things. And then we have strategic models, and you're going to hear about one of those this semester as well, where you're looking at, I'm still down at a very low level of resolution. I might be looking at all of Oregon or counties within Oregon or something, but I have a lot more behavioral detail than I used to have in a sketch planning model, and I can use a strategic model to test a lot of different permutations of assumptions. You can look at all kinds of scenarios, find out which ones are the most important, and study them closely. In fact, you can use these two together. You can use this to screen a lot of things where the cost of being wrong is low, and you might find a couple of scenarios that you want to look at for policy planning, and you say, I'm going to study those with the activity-based model because the cost of being wrong there is high because there's a lot of money riding on it. And then there's a couple of others out there. There are agent-based models and AI models, and I'll talk about those in a moment or two. There's two things that you should know about this graph, though. One is that this is relatively cheap down here. It doesn't cost much to spin up a sketch planning model. But as you go in either axis, the cost goes up in terms of the data that are required to build this thing, in terms of the sophistication, the runtime, the account of modeling motorheads that you need to put in a room to make the thing work. All of the costs go up as you go up there. Now, activity-based models, they're pretty costly now, but the cost is coming down because, like everything else, from pharmaceuticals to fashion, as you get mature in that particular market, the cost does come down because we're able to reuse components and recirculate knowledge. But right now, that's what's going on. And the other thing I would tell you about this graph, and if you remember nothing else I tell you at all, remember this. You're going to hear from some really gifted modelers who have built some models, and they all operate in this space up here, high fidelity, high resolution. Really cutting edge stuff. And they're going to tell you that these are better models than these right here. But the thing you must keep in mind that better is only relevant within the context of what the model is going to be used for. So if you have policymakers out there running around after you, they want information about something, and they're okay with this level of fidelity and maybe this level of resolution. Actually, it's the other way around. And you can answer with a disaggregate model. You're wasting money, time, and oftentimes high blood pressure medication by operating up there when you could be down here. So better is contextual. Remember that. So why would we go up there to that point of the corner if it's so stressful and demanding? Well, a couple of years ago, the Transportation Research Board came out with a report that was kind of to goad us in the modeling field to think about more sophisticated models. And this is one of their recommendations. And the thing I wanted to just highlight was that they identified a lot of reasons why we go there. Because when we first started out with models, we were looking at justifying fixed guideway transit systems and new highways in urban areas. Big things that had big impacts. And we were interested in trying to cure things like congestion, which was a fool's errand, but that's another story for another time. But the point is now we're doing modal trade-offs. And we're looking at operational analyses, which require high levels of resolution. And we're looking at policy and revenue sort of things, which is a high level of fidelity, especially if you want to get pricing right. And indeed, if they would have wrote this report in 2012 instead of 2007, of course, you'd have other things up here. Like what else? Sorry? Health. Health? How about climate change? What else would be up there? Think about energy. As prices are going up, we're starting to think about energy futures and things like that. Wasn't really on the radar back in 2007. Another big thing that's going on right now is, if you're reading paper, you know that funding for infrastructure is getting tighter and tighter as traditional sources are drying up. And there are going to be some huge equity battles about how the dwindling funds are spent over the remaining 20 years. And we're starting to see these in a lot of places right now. And so this calls for a progressively more sophisticated set of models than what you have right now. So what I see is that in the future, probably most of our travel models and most of our land use models are going to be activity-based models here in the future. We'll still use disaggregate models because they'll inform in places where we don't require answers to sophisticated questions. But I see really the sketch and the aggregate models, they hit the vanishing point. And strategic models will probably increase, especially when they're used with some of these other things. I'll talk about agents in a minute, but AI over here stands for artificial intelligence. And that's an interesting story unto itself because that could be the sleeper in the crowd in terms of where models are going in transportation. Let me tell you why. Maybe. When we build our models right now, every model that you hear about for the next couple of weeks, it's going to be built on the tenets of econometric modeling. And we have very formal ways of estimating these models, and we build them on travel survey data that are very carefully collected, and it's informed by theory. Works really well. There's a whole other group of people out there that are developing an entirely different set of models. People that have used models to support decisions about infrastructure, the built environment, have tended to use these models. Not because they're great, just because we have. But the people that are developing infrastructure for transportation and urban systems, the Googles of the world, they're all doing this. And Apple and AT&T in Northern California right now, they've been following people with cell phones for a long time because they notice that people, when they travel, they seem to have an obsessive need to talk while doing so. And so we have a very rich database that tracks people all over Kingdom Come, and they start to learn about your patterns from it. And rather than going out and working in this where they say there's too many questions, and this is too hard to apply if you have data on everyone, they're looking at pattern matching. They're into the world of artificial intelligence. They want to know what trends can I cull out of these data that are going to help me in future. And so it's a very different modeling mindset. You'll see more about it. I don't think anyone will talk about it, but it's going there. And hopefully in the next couple of years, we'll see these two things kind of converge. So the way we used to build aggregate and sketch planning models was a relatively seat-of-the-pants, time-honored way of doing anything that we've done in infrastructure for the last 50 years. You start out with a brilliant design, you write a specification like I said, and then you turn your team loose and you let them develop a model. And at the very end, you package the delivery. You've got code, you've got documentation, you've got knowledge transfer and everything else like that. And if you're building a high-fidelity, high-resolution model, from about here to about here is a couple of years. So whether you have a bunch of team of consultants doing this or a bunch of people working in a public agency, the normal grind is you specify all this stuff, you turn them loose, and you start doing prayers that, you know, on this date, they'll actually be there. Now, in the field of software, as well as in the field of modeling, we've had some spectacular failures. And more often than not, the big design up front, the BDUF, fails us. Because the complexity of what we're doing just is more than we can stuff into our heads. And so as a consequence, the software development people have come up with a new way of thinking called agile development. And I got to think about that. Well, I can do agile modeling. And in a nutshell, you spend a lot of time understanding up at front what's going on. Because all of the models you're going to hear about in the next 12 weeks, with the possible exception of one, had never been done before. So while you think you know what you're going to do, you really don't know until you get there whether it's going to work or not, which is both incredibly fun and incredibly frustrating at the same time. So the gist in agile development is that I'm going to break this into increments. And at the end of each increment, I'm going to have a working model. So the first time you go through this, you say, well, I'll spend some time building the core architecture of this thing. I'm going to build the simplest thing that can possibly work. I'm going to get this thing up and running, and I'm going to make it work. Will it answer my policy question? Shoot, no. Has no prayer of doing it. But you can at least tell whether the structure is going to work, whether your computer architecture is going to work and everything. And you successively add more details till you get down to the end, and you're spending very little time revising design, and you're spending a lot of time packaging for delivery. Now, you could do the same thing up here. This forces structure onto you. And as you will learn that modelers are Class A geeks, which makes them Class A procrastinators, and it also embeds them with a genetically wired sense of false security and enthusiasm about tasks. So when we do this in real life, what we do is we still come up with a design up front where we say, I'm going to build something magnificent, and we break it down into tasks, and we run it through what we call a sprint, which can be from 2 to 12 weeks, depending on what we're trying to do. And at the end of that sprint, we have a working model, an interim piece of model that has some functionality. But usually, a lot of times, I get people up like once a day talking about what did you do today, how are we going to get to the end of the sprint, is everything going fine? And you keep running this conveyor belt until everything that's over there moves over to here, and then you're happy. So to make this real for you, this is a model. I don't know that you'll hear a lot about this term, but this is Oregon's Integrated Transport Land Use Model. built from a program that was launched by a visionary named Bill Upton, formerly the Oregon Department of Transportation. And he started out with a series of models about the economy and how the state as a whole works. So he builds households and economy. Then he has a household evolution model, how these households change over time, and where business come down to in terms of where they want to work and who they trade with. And then there's a land market where households and businesses compete for that aspect of their production. And then you have some sort of market clearing function here. And once you know where people are and where they're going and everything, you can run them through an activity-based model of person travel and freight travel and external linkages and everything else like that. It's a beast, in other words. And so we got a team together. Everybody's going to do one module. We agreed on what the interfaces were going to look like, the data pathways, and zoom, turn everybody loose. And we had fun. But in some respects, it was less than edifying because everyone was operating at different paces and things sometimes didn't fall together as quickly as we'd like to. So Upton and I, with the perfect wisdom of 20/20 hindsight, said, well, we'll never do that again. What we ought to do is do an agile modeling approach where we say, these are the functions across the top that we wanted to have that I showed you on a little chart before, but we'll get there incrementally. For example, in land use, you say, I'll start with the very simplest allocation I can possibly do. And then maybe I'd add manual overrides, things like CBDs and big box developments that you couldn't expect a model to guess right about. And then maybe there's some undeveloped or underdeveloped land. I'll redo that. I'll eventually get to the original model specification, but I'm going to do it piecemeal. Same way on the transport side. I might have a quick response, which is a sketch planning transport modeling framework, and I start adding pieces of the activity-based model. So at the end, I get to where I originally said I was going to be. But here's what's important. At each step along the way, you have a model that works. Now, does the top model work at all? No, not really. I mean, you get stuff out of it, but you'd never use it for anything serious. But as you go along, you gain experience with your model system. You learn things that you never figured out in the first place. So here's another example. This is something a little bit more recent from when I've done defense logistics work, and I don't have time to explain it, but here's the gist. We have an agent-based simulation, and each agent is out there, is an autonomous software entity, and we're trying to figure out how to make logistics work. So if you decapitate command and control, in other words, all the people that make a lot of money go away, and the individual carriers have to figure out how to best distribute all of the goods that are needed in the simulation in the least cost manner. How would it work? Well, then agents have to talk to one another, and they have to broker their loads and everything else like that. So we knew from the literature that extended contract net protocol was the way to go. It'd take a long time to implement this thing. We just wanted to get started, so we just randomly allocate stuff to a bunch of trucks and turn them loose, and airplanes and things like that, and said that's the simplest thing that can possibly work. Then we had a lazy search. We said, well, we'll make it a little bit better by taking the low-hanging fruit. And then one day, when we were sitting out at a certain place that is more known for the quality of margaritas and the raging intellect that goes on inside of it, we came up with this thing called MFD, or Modified Functional Design, which was kind of our seat-of-the-pants thing, and said, well, if you couldn't do something really formal that was an optimization model, how could you just kind of make a best guess and go with it and see what happens? And so, zoom, off we go. So management wanted to see how this thing evolved. So of course, when we did something random, the solution quality was crap, but it ran blazingly fast. And the bosses said, well, I'd be happy up here with high solution quality and really blazingly fast. And you say, yeah, right, wouldn't anybody? But we'd settle for something like over here, where I'd settle for a little bit less quality, but I don't want this thing to run for half of eternity. We said, yeah, fine, we can work on that. So then the next thing is we tried this lazy search, which was just look at something immediately around you, see if you can trade with them, and it worked barely better. So then we did the MFD. So we thought, well, let's see what happens. So, wow, we got a big jump in solution quality for not a big jump in simulation time. So Now you got the professors. This is going to kick butt because this is elegant, it's well grounded in theory, and it's going to take us way up over the red line there. So usually what I do is I get people to come up here and put their fingers on the screen, but this is not really practical. So I'm going to put this here, and you tell me whether to move this thing up, down, left, or right, where you think number 4 wound up. Right? Up or down? Further? Like there? Well, doggone, you guys are right. That's exactly where Contract Net Protocol took us. A lot more computer time, very perceptible increase in solution qualities. And so then the eggheads went back and they said, let us think about that. Okay, why did that happen? Oh, well, because there's a lot of things in extending Contract Net Protocol that are going to make this thing set up and bark for us. So we got to go do that. So we did. And it wound up there. Now, the point to be made here is that if we would have done the big design up front, we would have done this right here. Because you would have been subject to intense ridicule and scrutiny if you would have said at the outset that this outcome would have obtained. Nobody believed this. I mean, it wasn't quite heretical, but I mean, you'd be looked down upon by doing this. In the end, we settled on MFD. We just stayed there. I mean, that's the place for us. And we made a lot of other decisions like this in building a simulation model. So for us, if you can learn how to love the system, you can do some really cool things in it. Because as you are gaining knowledge, as you're building something, you're able to affect the trajectory of what you're building. You save a lot of resources. And when you start doing this thing, man, it was amazing for us. And as I look at it, I think this is the only way you can build some of these really high fidelity, high resolution models that have never been built before without losing your butt. So, say you build it. How do you know if it's good? Now, most of you probably won't be in the business of building models, and I admire you for that. But most of you may be consumers of models, and so you have to be smart about what you're buying. And this is what I want to talk about a little bit now. So how do you know if a model's any good? Well, you could do assertion. I could stand up and I could tell you that it's good, and you say, well, anyone that's been around doing that stuff and still saying after all these years, maybe I'd believe him. In fact, kind of a humorous thing is that I have some people that work with me back in Albuquerque, and they are smarter than I am. They're more productive than I am. They write better code than I do, and they can run a 10K faster than I can. And I'm not slow. They can go in and they can tell a client X because of Y, and it always turns out that they have a 20-minute conversation with them about why that's true. I can go in and I can tell them X because of Y, and they say, oh, okay, and zoom, off they go. It happens like clockwork. It really ticks them off. But if you can get away with it, that works, right? Another way is rationalization. So I got the outcome of this model. Yeah, that's great. Now, how did it get there? Does it pass the giggle test? Can I explain how I took these inputs and I got this output? And if you can, well, maybe that's okay. But most of us, we use a more scientific method called validation, which I'm going to explain in excruciating detail shortly, and verification. And verification is usually just, does the software do what I told it to do? Whereas validation is more, did the model do what I intended it to do, which is kind of a different thing, and you'll see the subtle difference here in a moment. So there are a lot of definitions about validation, but some of the titans in the field, they describe it as accuracy. And accuracy, let's see, accuracy. That's a statistical concept. There's, of course, always the critic in the crowd, but I like Reichel's definition the best. He says it means it's well-grounded. In other words, that means that there are a lot of reasons to believe that this model is good, besides just the fact that it does well in the statistical analyses. But, and this is important, it's only good and appropriate for the end in view. You can have a lot of models, folks, that are valid for what it was originally developed for, that has no validity when it's used outside of that realm. and that's an important thing to keep in mind. So when we use it in our domain, when you're looking at transport models, it gets even kind of scarier because we put a lot of faith in the statistics. In fact, we put a lot of faith in replicating traffic counts. And I'm going to show you the reason you want to do that here in a moment. But once we do that, we say a lot about accuracy. And because we're looking at comparing traffic counts to what the model says, you can only do that at the very end of the entire model development process, because it's only about that point when you can actually put your model flows on the network. And then, well, do you believe it looks good? Well, I guess it depends. So in essence, what it looks like is this. I start building a model, and I test it. I compare to these traffic counts. Does it work? If it worked the first time, it's what we call in engineering a Class A miracle. Most often, you feed back up, and you keep tinkering with it until you do get it to work, and then you go celebrate. So here's what this beloved test of observed versus estimated counts look like. On the horizontal axis is the count that we made on a bunch of links. So this, if it were in Portland, it would be all over the Portland area. We'd take traffic counts. And up on the vertical axis is what the model says is supposed to be in there. And like, for example, right here, let's see, this guy here is 15,000. We counted 15,000 vehicles, and the model said, I'm guessing about 1,500. Now, if you knew nothing else about these models, which model is better? Yeah. Does anybody believe this one's better? Now, let me tell you about these models. Okay, so this model here is a truck model for Chicago. And this is before we got done with calibration. But this is what happened when we first ran the model. There are two times you need margaritas when you're developing models. The first time you run it, and when you're celebrating its completion. And so this is the first time we ran it through, but it's a behavioral model. This thing over here, what I did was I took a random number generator, and I just randomly generated the number of trips that were going to occur in every zone in Chicago. And then I used this really clever technique called synthetic matrix estimation, which goes through and it warps the origin-destination matrix successively until it gets a matrix that gives rise to those counts. This is what we call a crock. I mean there's no model here at all. This is a model, albeit not a very good one at that point. So you say, well, why are things that complex? Well, we live in a complex world. And when you're modeling physical systems, usually they're not so hard to be accurate with. But when you're modeling society, which has a lot of inherent variability built into it, that's hard. And then when you're trying to interact the two, so you have models that are looking at the interaction between physics and people, it becomes blazingly difficult. And moreover, there's a lot of things we don't know about both systems. If we had perfect knowledge of society, we wouldn't need a model. We would know. We could tell you what's going to happen if you did something. But the reality is we build these models from small segments of data. We have a lot of error in it, a lot of noise, and everything else like that. And so we've got to find a way to do it. So this guy named Barlas comes from systems dynamics, and he's come up with this thing called process validation. And his basic pitch is that it's not so important what outcome you got, but it's equally important how'd you get there. And so he looks at it and says, you know, if the structure is wrong, then the behavior that emanates from it has got to be wrong as well. And so this graph I just showed you over here, this is something where it has no structure at all, but got great behavior, but it's in an invalid model. So what can I do to build something better? So you still start with building my model, and then there's a couple of structure tests that I perform. And if I pass them, great. If I don't, I keep revising until I got an appropriate structure. And then once I got that appropriate structure I can believe, then I'll go on and I'll look at the behavior. So some of the tests we do up here in the structure end of it, I look at the parameters. Do they make sense? Do they reproduce the statistical distribution that I started out with? If I test them outside the range of the data, do they go into orbit around Neptune, or are they reasonable? Sometimes I look at the literature, other models and stuff like that. I feed the results to experts and I say, you know, does this look right? And only after I pass that, then I go down to the next part here where I do the behavior test. And I look at extreme conditions. We do a lot of sensitivity testing of this model to make sure it's right. And then I do a Turing test. The model tells a story. I go tell the story to someone that's smart about this domain and ask them, you know, does this resemble your world? And if it does, great. If it doesn't, I got work to do. And then finally, I get to the pattern test that we looked at earlier. So in another case, you know, I might look at the observed versus estimated volumes, and I'd say, yeah, that looks pretty good. Or I might look at trip-length distributions, the observed versus the estimated, and I'd say, yeah, I did good. But the point about this is that I learned enough along the way about having the right structure and the right behavior that it wasn't hard to get those right patterns at the end. And when it didn't work, I knew how to fix them. So when you're looking at building a whiz-bang, new sophisticated sort of model, you want to find someone that thinks this way and has this as a mindset. And if they do, they're far more likely to end up with a successful modeling project, whether they use the BDUF or whether they use something agile. So the last thing is credibility I want to talk to you about, and it's only one slide, but an unfortunate reality of life is that for the last 10 years or so, I haven't gotten the ability to do anything related to modeling. I love modeling. Nothing better for me than to be left alone and to be able to do this kind of thing. But I don't get to do this anymore because the aforementioned people that work with me think that I'm a throwback to a previous era who might be better off, you know, controlled. And so I spent a lot of time dealing with legislators and high-speed rail board members and investment bankers and people like that. And I've come to find out that they look at a model's credibility a whole lot differently than we do. So when a modeling motorhead comes into my office and sits down, and I says, well, if it's theoretically plausible and passes the Google test, and they've gone through and they've done all the statistical tests I just told you about, I'd say, that's a great model. Yes, woof. But no one else I know looks at it that way. So for the last 10 years, I've been keeping a little journal, which won me a bet with my wife who said I'd never be able to keep it, where every time I run into some of these big politicians or decision makers, I ask them, how do you know whether the model's great or not? And here's in order their list. They say, independent peer review is the most important thing. If a bunch of experts will vouch for it, yeah. Confidence in the analyst. Unfortunately, if you stand up and you project well, you answer questions well on your feet, under pressure and things like that, and you just come across well, they put a lot of confidence in your work. And that's a whole other lecture for another time, but that was amazing to me. I didn't expect that. Ability to visualize results. There's only a few people that can sit down, take open, and take a look at a statistical estimation or look at Python code and look at it and form in their mind an image of the model. But if they can see the results, they like that. Obvious flaws are a big deal. If you have one, it invalidates the entire model and the analyst, and you face an uphill battle after that. You can see, you know, a couple of other things. Agency buy-in, who believes it in addition to you. But the thing that I wanted you to focus on, and so I made it nice and bright, is that what we think are really important, the first things that we look at are the last things that policymakers look at when they're trying to assess the credibility of a model. And folks, they don't even care in the least about all the statistics. Their eyes roll back in their heads, and you have to catch them as they're falling over backwards off the chair. So anytime you build a model, approach it this way, not just this way. And incidentally, that's the process validation way of looking at things. So here's my obligatory comment from my very favorite management theorist. And here are two papers I'd highly recommend on process validation, and I'm done. Any questions you have for Kelly? She's ready for them.
Okay, so one thing I forgot to say in my introduction is that we are webcasting this, which means when you ask questions, you need to use the microphone. Most of you will have a microphone on your desk. Hold the touch button down, keep the red light lit while you're asking the question. If you don't have the microphone on your desk or it's not working
You know, of course, it varies from instance to instance, but I found in most instances that if they believe the model, if it was a credible piece of work, it has really influenced and changed people's minds in a lot of instances. And nowhere is this more true than in the area of pricing, where a lot of people come in and they say, this is a politically dead thing, don't even come and bother us with it. And you go in and you do some sort of analysis and you find out that, well, pricing might work, and it might be an attractive alternative, and it has really changed people's minds. Same way with equity. When you go in and you do a credible job with equity, people change their minds. I've seen it happen enough that even I'm impressed. Yes, sir. Okay, let me start with the second one first. The best antidote that I know of for ideology guiding the model is, number one, to have a peer review, and number two, if you're an agency, put it up on the web. Because people start to look at it and they're able to say something about it. That's great. That forces you to confront head-on why you made some of the assumptions, why you made some of the decisions about it. And I don't think that people, I think more of it is not so much overt, but maybe, you know, subconsciously thinking about, well, how does my belief permeate into this and cause me to do things? We used to believe in our models, for example, that, well, nobody would walk more than half a mile to transit. And so we built these transit models and said no one would walk more than half a mile. Why? Because you got a bunch of, you know, overweight white boys sitting in a room building a model saying, I'd never walk more than half a mile to transit, you know. But when this got out and saw the light of day, that was the end of that, for example. Number of inputs, that's hard to say. You know, there are some people out there that say, you know, you get more than 3 moving parts in a model, and you start to get a wild number of different permutations that are possible out of it. All the models that you're going to be hearing about have a ridiculously large number of inputs to them. But most of them are not influencing the behavior of the model. Most of the time you've got 5 or 6 different variables that impact it. And then you've got a bunch of variables that describe how society is structured, what their income is, you know, how big their household is, and things like that. So there are different types of data. So that's a good question, but it's a hard one to answer. Yes, sir.
So in the beginning of your slides, you outlined the basic, the three parts of a model, and one of them being data. A lot of data is being used to disaggregate or activity-based. Can you, what kind of activity-based things do you think there isn't data available on that can be used in the future, or once it's available, will really inform and increase the size of activity-based modeling?
For a long time, we've used household travel surveys and we've asked people to enumerate all the trips they make during the day. And when we build the aggregate models that we described earlier, and even the disaggregate models, there is a low consequence to missing some of the smaller trips that people always missed, for example. When you build an activity-based model, it really screwed things up. And so we've had to pay a lot closer attention to getting all the trips that people make, including ones that are easy to forget about. Like when you leave here and you hoof over and you grab some pizza and you come back, that's a trip. We want to know about that. But otherwise, we assume you didn't eat lunch or something else like that. People just don't think about that, you know. But if they have to go to Jake's to eat lunch, they remember that. That's an ordeal, you know, from here. We don't really collect any more data right now for activity-based models than we did before. The one thing that we want to learn about is inter-household interactions. Okay, you made this decision with this individual. Why did you make it with that individual? We've never asked that in the past, but we're going to have to be smarter about that in the future. Yes, sir.
My main question was about the agile development process, which is basically like an iterative design paradigm. Do you think the primary advantage of that comes from the fact that you have regular milestones, so you can kind of like see progress happening and have functional systems before it's entirely done, or the fact that you de facto have to try multiple solutions to the problem?
I'd say the two major advantages of it, number one is every month you have the client sitting there with you, and you have queso and chips and margaritas, and you tear down the model, and you make sure that it does everything you want it to do, and it's evolving the way he or she wants it to. And the other thing I would say is that if you know for sure that your model is going to work at the outset, you can do the big design up front, and it's just as efficient. More frequently, though, when we build big models like I was talking about earlier, we really don't know what this thing is going to look like when it comes down, and more than likely it's going to morph along the way. And it's really easy to morph when you're doing agile because you're making decisions on a monthly basis, whereas before, whether it's within a public agency or with a consultant, you have a thing called a contract. You will do this. And so that's pretty rigid. You know, so once you get on that course, you're on it. Yes, sir.
Following up on that, do you know of any models transport models that have used the agile development process approach?
We're doing it in Oregon right now. I've done a lot of it up at Los Alamos, and some of the stuff that I do with my folks, like the aforementioned Chicago truck model, is a living, breathing study in that. Start with the simplest thing you can possibly build, and go up to something elegant, and find out everything you didn't know about truck models along the way. Way back in the back. Good. Kelly can answer the question since she's right there with the microphone.
If I remember correctly, you said that there's been some spectacular failures with modeling. What's one particularly memorable failure?
Oh, man. You know, when you're looking at price, there's this tendency to go through and look at pricing and say, okay, the lower the price, the more people will use the service. But of course, you know that if you want to travel somewhere like on Thanksgiving or close to like today, prices are much higher and people pay for them. It also happens to be when the prices are highest is the highest demand. So people in the past have developed these models of mode choice where they say, well, price and demand are inversely related. And they've made some really wrong decisions about how pricing works around stadiums, like the one that has recently been built in Arlington, Texas for the new Cowboy Stadium, for example. They vastly underestimated what was going on there. Same way with a couple of light rail projects in the San Francisco Bay Area, where they really underestimated the amount of weight that people would put, that they would pay for reliability in a system. We always looked at just travel time savings, and never bothered to try to monetize reliability because we didn't know how to measure it. But when we put that in the model, man, you got all kinds of different results out of it.
I guess in that same vein, since there are the differing perspectives or views on validation, as a modeler, how do you keep the decision makers from choosing a model that's not valid and avoiding the situations that you just described?
I've never had a decision maker want to know the details of validation. It's always come down to the credibility. If I say that it passed validation, that's fine. Now, they may not believe that it's a valid model because it may not answer things in a sensible sort of way, but I've never seen them ask anything about validation. And in fact, if you try to force them to listen to it, bad things happen. And so we rarely go there. Way back in the corner. Yes, ma'am.
You mentioned the tracking of cell phones in Northern California for the infrastructure thing, and I was wondering if you could give more examples of where you're getting infrastructure data.
Well, that's the primary place. They look at it and say, well, everyone's got a smartphone nowadays, and it used to be 10 years ago when we first ran these tests, we found that there were so few cell phone towers in San Francisco that you could only tell vaguely where someone was when they're moving around just by pinging their cell phone every so often. And moreover, if you ask AT&T for cell phone data back then, you get the tsunami of data. Nobody had any idea what to do with it, or how to process it, or even have anything big enough to hold it all. Of course, now with Hadoop and MapReduce and some of these other Google distributed database products, they figured out how to store all this data in the cloud. And we've gotten a lot, and now that there's a cell phone tower every 2 blocks in San Francisco, even without the GPS turned on, you can be very precise about where people are moving. So precise, in fact, that Google can look at it, and with their own employees, they can figure out they're on a bike, they're walking, they're on Muni, or on an automobile, and they're 100% right every time. Just looking at trajectories as they move through the system. The other thing that's really interesting, and this is almost sexist, but they can tell what sex you are just by the way that you dwell at certain places. Because, of course, they have all the map data as well, right? So they can link up where you're at. So how many people of your friends all show up at the same place, how long you dwell there and everything else like that, zoom, they got it. And they've checked it on their employees, and they're absolutely right. And so all this kind of information. Now the big challenge is, okay, now that I have all this information, I'm learning something about patterns and everything, how do I push that back out? And of course, Google's thinking about just how do I push out. Everybody else is thinking, how am I going to make money on this thing, pushing it back out? And that's the big challenge right now. Yes, ma'am.
Can you talk a little more about what the artificial intelligence models would look like, and if so? It sounds like the data is coming from, proprietary sources, and what kind of I guess I'm curious about sort of how, if that's on the horizon, what's that going to look like in terms of the sort of public-private relationships that would need to be built in order to make
I
that
think
happen?
all that's still way off in the future. Right now, when we do a travel survey of households, if you're feeling really rich, you can probably survey 0.5% of all the households in an urban region. And that's a pretty small number. And when you do these household travel surveys, you usually miss everyone in this room because you're never at the phone. You're almost impossible to capture when they're trying to call you at home to recruit you for a survey. So they know nothing at all about any of you. So the AI guys are saying, well, if we knew a lot about 25% of the population, we'd know a lot more than we know right now about people. But I only need to know what they do. I don't need to know why they do it. I don't even care why they do it. All I want to know is what do they do, how often, and how likely is it that they will do the same thing tomorrow. And if they don't do the same thing tomorrow, what will they do more than likely? And from that, they can figure out what's going on. Because when you're thinking about infrastructure and you're thinking about real-time traveler information, you don't really care what you're going to do 20 years from now. They want to be able to sell you information that's going to help you travel better tomorrow. And so the timeline is completely different. So they're using these pattern models, and they might look at you and they say, I'm going to look at her, I'm going to look at the gal next to her, and I'm going to see, do they look the same? What can I know about her based on what I know about you because you're a friend, for example? And that's an entirely different way of linking up data than we're able to do right now. And there are a lot of techniques in artificial intelligence that do that, but we're stupid about them in the field of transport modeling. I'm done?
So we're out of time for this week. So thank Rick for an interesting talk. He will be joining us again.